Good evening and welcome to the Photography Salon, brought to you by the Motel Collection, gallery collaboration between Kalman, Brighton and Motel. And we started hosting these fortnightly talks because our gallery space in East London is currently closed. And but that gave me the chance to speak to the lovely Max today. Hi, Max.
Hello, Vera. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Oh, I just want to quickly say, Max is the course leader of the MA in Photojournalism and Documentary Photography at London College of Communication. She's an editor, a writer, and a curator, and we will be talking about documentary photography in the 21st century today. Yeah, I'm just gonna start with the first question. So, obviously it's quite a big topic, and just to kind of narrow it down a bit, which areas and aspects within documentary photography would you say have evolved the most in the last 20 years?
Yeah, thanks, Vera. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak with you this evening. So obviously, yeah, big question, but I took some time earlier to make a few notes, so when I glance that way, that's what I'm looking for. So I tried to cover as many I can think about because, well, not so coincidentally, but that's when I began in photography at the turn of the millennium, when I was asked to write about a set of images when I'd only just been a journalist, as I've mentioned before. So my first kind of job was as a writer for what became Photo 8 magazine, but was initially an online publication. And it developed into an actual print magazine, kind of the other way around, the online version happened first in that instance. And it was very much for the industry, by the industry in the beginning. So yeah, I was looking through the earliest issues of the magazine today, and there definitely were, lots of white men reporting on issues. I must say they did it very well. It was people like Kai Wiedenhofer reporting on Palestine, Adrian Fisk in India. We also had some brilliant reportage from China by Qilai Shen, which was really, really good. I remembered that strongly. Beautiful piece by Heidi Bradner on Alaska. So there was a mixture of people and issues, and there was certainly a lot of writing from foreign correspondents and from picture editors. That's what I mean by very kind of industry. And it was influenced, I'd say, most overtly by a humanist tradition. And obviously the humanist tradition has all the influences of paternalism and colonialism, actually, that go in tandem with that. But I think that Photo 8's development over the 11 years of its existence that I was at, I think it went on for a year and a half after that, and how it developed in terms of who we published in the magazine, how we changed when John Levy, the founder of Photo 8, relinquished the editorship to myself and Lauren Hines. It changed over this time from a monthly supplement, almost like a kind of weekend magazine supplement, but with more, photo stories, to a really thick biennial. And with the thick biennial, we tried to, it was more like posing a kind of curatorial question for the whole issue, as opposed to loads of really good photo stories on kind of social justice issues. And so we did one on the West's relationship with oil, and what became the final magazine issue in 2011 was how Islam was seen from the West. And so I thought, well, I better definitely have a look at this issue. And I remembered that I interviewed Abbas, the amazing late now Magnum photographer. I was really nervous about that interview. He was very generous with his questions. And so it really surprised me that he'd used this amazing phrase when I asked him a question about whether his photography had changed after 9/11. And he talked about the suspended moment. Oh, by the way, he replied that he changed his subject. He renewed his subject, but not his style, to whether or not his photography had changed. But yeah, this phrase that he used about his work, the suspended moment, is obviously very different to the idea of the decisive moment on which the Magnum agency of which he was part was founded on. And I didn't think anything particularly of it at the time. It was interesting. But there was a conversation that I was listening to the other day. It was one of the amazing conversations around the Arthur Jaffa film, led by Tina Campt. I don't know if you listened to those, but they're really brilliant. So, you know, Arthur Jaffa's film was streamed for the whole weekend in kind of 13 different institutions. Love is the message, and the message is death. And there was kind of a call for a different understanding of photography, which I'll go back to in a second, you know, kind of away from this idea of the decisive moment. So there's a few ideas that came together in that for me. A book that I've always understood as trying to get to the essence of photography is Camera Lucida by Roland Barthes. And I noticed that there's a huge new, it looks amazing, anthology that Odette England has brought together that I don't own and haven't seen the contents page for yet. And so I don't know if what I'm about to say is in any way part of it. But related to my own PhD research this week, I read this essay by someone called Jonathan Bella, and he offers a really different reading of Camera Lucida. And I've read that book, I don't know, 10 times, you know, it's like that. And I had never noticed what an exceptionally brief and inattentive reading Roland Barthes gives to the photograph by Abaddon, that unforgettable photograph of William Caseby, born a slave, 1963. And what Bella in this essay made me think is that because Barthes just overlooks it, he literally overlooks this picture, when he's trying to understand the very essence of photography, he manages to kind of dismiss and disavow how a person becomes image. And I've just got a little quote that I wanted to read. He says that it's crystal clear that colonialisms and slavery and the institutionalization of its practices are part of the conditions by which bodies are first liquidated of subjectivity and reduced to images and signs for others to read. I thought that was really significant, and so I wondered if rather than this decisive moment, this kind of essence, that we had something else, which if a suspended moment, back to Abbas's phrase, not that he meant it like this exactly, but maybe we could recall, if we're suspending time, maybe we can recall the conditions under which a body becomes image. So that was a little thought that I had about how documentary photography is changing and maybe could change. And that's not to say that for a majority of practitioners, photographers, writers, artists, whoever, people, or the amazing people I've worked with, I'm not saying that they haven't thought about photography's histories of subjugation and control. They absolutely have, and they absolutely do. And obviously I'm not speaking actually on behalf of documentary photography since the turn of the millennium, but although a lot has changed, I think, in terms of agency, of people in the pictures, of who commissioning editors actually commission, you know, photographers actually from the countries where they want stories from. There are more women and non-binary people entering the industry, although I'd argue that they're still not as successful. Obviously, there's such a long way to go still in terms of race in particular, and in terms of whose voices get heard and whose work gets seen, and who the gatekeepers are. And I'll come back to this, you know, later in our conversation, of who have the tenure positions, who are the curators, etc., etc. And obviously, this is a wider discussion than just documentary photography. And, you know, if we are wondering, I don't think we're really wondering, but if we are, why there are still so few photographers of colour, or not enough photographers of colour being seen, other people in positions of power in the industry. And so when you look back to those moments around the history of photography, it's not surprising that the change has been so slow. I almost think the question is why, you know, why would people of colour even want to be involved in which, you know, the ideas around who has the right to look, and who, you know, do you even have the right to your own look, if that's the pre-history of photography bound up in racism. There's just such a long way to go, really. And yeah, this talk about completely inspired by Arthur Jaffa's work, this idea for the image as a living, breathing thing as opposed to being the object of property was just really strong for me. And we're not there yet. Documentary photography's gone some way, but it hasn't gone all that far. So I was thinking about, all right, then what are the dominant forms of expression now? So photographers want a gallery. Yeah, of course they do. They need money like everyone else does, and they want recognition. and that, I think, turns the practice, if a photograph is a commodity, into something really far from the heart of documentary photography, with this Latin root of dicere, to teach, at the heart of it. But on the other hand, documentary practice has been taking over institutions in a really kind of educative way. You know, we'll probably talk about forensic architecture again a bit later, but because it had this huge platform of being nominated for the Turner Prize, so forensic architecture, obviously the research agency based at Goldsmiths, founded by Susan Shipley and Neil Weisman, and their amazing investigative practices using forensic and spatial techniques, as I'm sure that everybody's listening knows, but just in case. You know, what they do, they turn the gallery into a forum for discussion. I'm really interested in a much more public role for documentary photography, kind of out of the gallery. I've written a little bit for a show we did at LCC on Capital City about, for example, Hans Hacker's work, or someone like Zoe Leonard. You know, the fact that I Want a Dyke for a President was shown on the High Line in New York. I don't think this is particularly documentary photography, but say the work that Disturb, you know, the French outfit, they put photojournalism over wars in cities to give it a different kind of context. Or even what, you know, my friend and colleague Sophia Karim had planned for the Turbine Hall pre-pandemic, to get loads of kind of samosa bags with peaceful messages of protest. It was going to film the Turbine Hall as a protest against rights in India, the citizenship law and other things. And then my visible justice, I'll talk about visible justice later, but it's a research collective that David Birkin and I founded at UAL. But the work that he did with Mariam Ghani in Times Square on a billboard to kind of juxtapose what was being spent by the government on healthcare and on weapons. I mean, I've oversimplified what they did, but basically that. But putting stuff really in public like this, I think is really, really, really important. But I saw something hilariously bad today, just on social media somewhere. Did you see the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo? He suddenly produced this sculpture, and it was this green styrofoam mountain that's supposed to represent the curve and the pandemic in New York. It's supposed to be, you know, a really kind of important thing to show what New York has dealt with. And I'm not saying that shouldn't be moralized, it should, but this green thing, it looked kind of like Shrek. There's been quite a lot of memes about it today. Someone is asking me to get closer to the mic. I just saw. Yeah. Here I come. I think it was Marussia.
Yeah, Marussia.
Oh, nice.
Hi, Marussia.
Is that better? Is that louder?
Yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, I heard you before, but maybe because of my headphones. And talking of public engagement, another thing that's happened, you know, since I've been in photography, I mean, I'm sure they happened before, it's just that I don't really know in this case, but photo festivals. So I went to Perpignan and Arles in the kind of early days of Photo 8, but one of the amazing artists that was in the first edition of the Firecracker book that Fiona Rogers and I co-authored, Ada Molene, she does Addis Photo Fest, and it's like the 6th edition now. And I think what someone like Lou Clements did with Format Festival in Derby, incidentally my hometown, but you know, she works in a really properly transcultural way. The work that she's done with Chinese photographers is really amazing. So I do think that photo festivals can do really good things for the medium. I like the way that they're programmed for the specialist and the shopper, basically. I mean, that works well for me. Yeah.
Both of those things. And then finally, the last really sort of big thing that I've noticed, I know we're going to talk about photo books later, so I won't talk about that now, but I think one of the really important ways in which documentary photography in particular has changed is in terms of a more collaborative practice, and you know, collaborative in a really real active sense. So like people like Becky Warnock and Jamila Prowse are pursuing, Anthony Lavera is pursuing, lots and lots of people I know are pursuing this. And when I say in the real sense, I just mean that I think in the worst sense, somebody sticking the label collaborative on it could be power relations by another name. But I've definitely witnessed ways in which kind of the practice has become less lonely, you know, less the idea of the single photographer doing his thing in the world, and working actively with participants, or whether it's working in collectives like you are. I know we're going to talk about that in a bit, or sharing work in a really collective way like with Photo Scratch. the kind of community work that Photo Fusion does, etc., etc. You know, things like that happening all over the country. Yeah, so although obviously it's a really shit time for the planet, I think that documentary photography is making some changes. It has a lot more to make, but if it does make them, it's going to become better and more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what I found quite striking about what you just said is how documentary photography becomes more and more accessible and is more and more used, you know, as a public kind of display of art. But as you said before, we're also going to talk about photo books because we both like them very much. But in terms of photo books, so they can also be quite they can also generate an exclusion because it's not accessible to everybody. So I was wondering, why has it become, for me, I feel like when I think about documentary photography, I also think about the photo book because, you know, like you said, it's kind of a way of owning it owning it as an object. So I was wondering, why has it become so such a popular choice for practitioners to present documentary work, especially when they have, you know, a lot of them is driven from a very political kind of very politically driven.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting question because I had to think about why it happened, because I definitely saw it happen. Obviously photo books weren't a new thing, but so what mainly happened was technology happened, and photographers do love technology. So I checked out when Blurb started, and that it was 2005, and that was kind of super accessible. So even though I wasn't quite in education then, as in teaching, by the time that I was in kind of 2009, 10, it's like everybody was producing a Blurb book, and I was obviously quite new to it. And there came a point where it's like, oh, hang on, let's actually ask the question, is this the best iteration for your project? But I mean, so many interesting things happened. There was the completely irresistible rise of someone like Bruno Chachel's self-published Be Happy, which also I looked up the date, that was 2010. So many independent publishers, like a bigger one like Dowie Lewis. I mean, he did such an incredible job with something like Lyra Brill's work and the epilogue, which was 2015. I can't even believe it was that long ago, but it was. And that was such a complex subject matter and kind of relationship between image and text. And my own sort of primary experience with the photo book was that I edited Crofton Black and Edmund Clark's Negative Publicity, Artifacts of Extraordinary Rendition. Oh, here's one you've prepared. Thanks, Sarah. Which was, it was published by Aperture, but it was designed by Ben Weaver at Here Press. And I think that Here and loads of other smaller imprints, you know, have had such an interesting time. I never know how to pronounce Maxwell Anderson. I should ask him. It's either Bimo Jake or Bemo Jake. But he published Monica Alcazar Duarte's amazing The New Colonialists. You know, there's the amazing trolley books that was founded by Gigi, but amazingly Hannah Watson carries the flag, and you know, she's published people like Hayley Morris Cafiro. And Hayley's platform in terms of online representation, sorry, and bullying, etc. It's so important to have that in public discourse and not just below the line weirdness. She's published people like Maisie Cousins, who have a really fresh and kind of sensual approach, I think, to photography. But the kind of leading up to publishing these emerging female artists was people like Stanley Green and Georgia Sodi, and these kind of, you know, and Philip Jones Griffiths was published by Trolley. Amazing. And I do think that, as I've spoken about a little bit before, but that photo books really can be a political necessity. You know, no one else is talking about this thing and it needs to be talked about. So, but at the same time, you know, like the Sweet Fly Paper of Life, it's my favorite example. You know, Langston Hughes and Roy DeCaraba published a book on life in Harlem in the 40s because of segregation, because everyone was talking about it, because these beautiful lives weren't being observed or recorded or remembered. So I do think the photo book can have a really important role, but are they niche and elitist? Well, in some ways, yes. I reckon average price for a photo book is 40 quid, which is a lot, especially if you like photo books. That's a real lot of money. And obviously you want to support people that you know. It's a lot of money and it's prohibitive. I'm not sure that kind of whoever the people are, politically interested people, but I'm saying in the older generation, I'm not sure that they would think of a photo book as being a way into those political discussions if they weren't history. And the younger people, I think for the most part, just flatly can't afford it, and obviously live a lot of their lives online. That's not to say they wouldn't like the photo book or they don't like the photo book, they do. But especially, again, people who want to be photographers. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I love the book sections at photo fairs and photo festivals, etc., but I mean, I'm thinking of polycopies when I say it's hard to keep afloat. Some of us that polycopies is done in a boat on the Seine. Yeah, it's really popular, it's really important, but there are really big questions about funding and accessibility. And so what I ended up thinking was that the book is one thing, which is great, but for all the people who aren't going to get it for lots and lots of reasons, what are you going to do at the same time? And I think that we'll go on to talk about other ways in which you can bring people to the ideas that photography brings, basically.
Yeah, so that was a very good intro to the next question. So, because of the lockdown, a lot of galleries and museums were forced, and photo festivals were forced to kind of, close their spaces, and some of them made virtual exhibitions, so they're accessible online. Photo Basel could be, an example for that. And so as you mentioned before, so how does that pose an opportunity to expand audiences through making exhibition more accessible and, therefore kind of democratize it a little bit more?
Yeah, and isn't it a shame that it takes a pandemic for all the, the institutions that platforms for differently abled people with all sorts of mental and physical health conditions have been asking institutions to do this, like always. Yeah, in some ways, online content democratizes because, a show at one of the big museums, it's like, again, 25 quid or something. I mean, there are amazing deals, like the Tate under 25 deal. You can see it Fiverr, which is fantastic. But even then, galleries and museums, even if they're free, they're not even welcoming to everybody. We had an academic at an away day at LCC a few years ago, and the stats, were brutal. They were horrific on who goes to museums for the most part, and no prizes for guessing. It's older white people. There was a meme I saw today of a very elderly, small white lady climbing in, and it said something like,
I saw that one.
Do you see it? Old white person pays £15 for a cup of Earl Grey and stale cake at the
Tate Britain.
Tate Britain, right. These academics, I'm afraid I don't remember their names, but they've done their research, and that was the answer. What I really do think, again, I'm going to talk about programming around the arts in general, and obviously documentary photography as well. And there are some really brilliant people I found in programming at these big institutions. And I'm going to talk about London ones because although I don't live in London, my work is based there. I promise I'm not talking about London because I think it's the centre of the earth. I know that there are amazing institutions from the Baltic in Gateshead to Impressions in Bradford to, the amazing gallery in Wolverhampton. I know this, but I know more about the ones in London because that's where I work and teach. And so, the Tate, Photographers Gallery, ICA, Autograph, they're programming seriously some brilliant events that I think, much more interestingly than only showing work, crack open the questions raised by the work. I listened to an autograph. I signed up for an autograph talk, just almost not without thinking about it, but just, I want to do that last night, and maybe some audience members listened to it as well. And there was no focus on art. There were two experts, an immigration lawyer and the head of the Race Equality Foundation, Javier Butt, and the immigration lawyer was Colin Yell. And they were talking about, rights basically and health in relation to COVID-19, obviously, and healthcare for asylum seekers. And it was just fantastic that Autograph hosted this. And obviously the people suffering were people of colour, and that being the point of Autograph foregrounding this information, and that for the audience to understand that that's what's at stake when we talk about art, we're also talking about, you know, whose bodies matter. We're always talking about that. And that was the whole debate, and it was completely fascinating. It was just fact. And by the end of it, you know, the main conversation, I think, really was around the UK being a hostile environment for people of colour. And yeah, I haven't been able to get it out of my head. So that was super important. And obviously, sorry, I mean, I feel like I'm going away from the question. I do believe in making galleries more accessible and doing that online. You know, you'd mentioned Art Basel, and I looked it up dutifully, and I've looked at there's a list somewhere, I think it's probably on Hyperallergic, of the 2,500 galleries you can see online, and I'm really, really into that. But I'm not great at having the concentration for a kind of 3D or even more VR. I haven't even done that, but walk around the gallery space. And so, yeah, I just keep thinking that the programming, like the springboard, like art or documentary photography being the springboard to this other discussion, is the more vital aspect of a democratizing that can obviously happen online. And I just thought, so what would I really like? I'd really like, I was going to, you know, an artist or a curator, but actually anyone who's got something to say, to just stand there to camera and talk about one of the images in the show, to do a really slow, just talk about an image in the show. That would be a really beautiful thing. I don't know how much that happens. Otherwise, personally, I find that now everything's online a bit overwhelming. But then, having said that, I also find actual exhibitions a bit overwhelming sometimes as well. I know I'm not the only person, and I think that institutions have to address that as well. It's not that I don't believe in exhibitions, and a lot of the places that I've mentioned, it's not like they're all doing, you know, this person is important, so therefore you will come and see the show. You know, they're much more sophisticated curatorial strategies for sure. But if I'm going to bother to go to an exhibition or even to look at one online, it's about the juxtapositions, and it's about having a sensory experience in some way. And I think that both in person and online, I think there's quite a lot of catching up to do in making those ideas collide, and to kind of have this sensory experience. I don't know if tech could do that. So what do we need? We need a way, I guess, for the image to be, for the imagination to be fired up by the image.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, that's a good quote. I do know what you mean with, you know, like kind of you're not completely there, you know, when you go through a virtual, it's, you know, like the Zoom fatigue.
Yeah.
I mean, thank you everybody for joining us today. But, you know, when you're like in front of a screen all day and then you go to another screen and watch a talk, it's just so easy to get distracted. And I booked a ticket today for the Masculinities exhibition at the Barbican, which I haven't seen before the lockdown, and I'm quite excited about that. But
and that's so rich. There are so many bodies of work with definitely curatorial questions. Props to Alona Pardo for that. I've only been once, and I think you need to go at least 6 times, but that was overwhelming in a good way.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Getting out of the house. Well, you know, leading from that, I would just quickly want to talk about how Instagram kind of enabled a platform to have this more inclusive experience for photographers to present their work and, you know, broaden their audience. And how would you assess, is that going to change the future of documentary photography, this more like, you know, heavily social media presence?
Yeah, I genuinely, I go so far as to say I know that it already has in terms of commissioning, and that's not just you know, commissioning editors in newspapers and magazines like the people I know. I know that it's happening in fashion and like all the industries that use photography. Instagram is basically a lookbook, and so, you know, I think if anyone's listening to this talk who really wants to get commissioned, have a good Instagram. Just be interesting, just be original, be yourself. Don't overthink it. Just do it. You know, it's just post an image. I really like it. I get a lot of my my visual knowledge from Instagram. I do hear about good stuff, talks and stuff on Twitter. I think I've managed to kind of filter out the anger brigade, the angry brigade, possibly. But what I would like to talk about, but unfortunately can't particularly, but is TikTok. So I haven't pursued it like massively, but what the little bit I have seen is really amusing, and it reminded me that a few years ago I wrote a piece and actually held a small symposium at LCC on the idea of using wit and humour as a strategy in photography, actually based on women's work. And I really like that idea. I think that photography isn't very funny a lot of the time, and you can deal with really serious issues in a really funny way. I mean, Hayley Morris Kafiro's work has a lot of wit in it. Someone like Gemma Marmalade's work, ditto. Claude Cahun. I think that there are lots of interesting ways of doing that, and I think that maybe partly because wit is usually associated with like verbal discourse, maybe that's why it isn't used, or maybe it's just because, if it's documentary photography, it's supposed to be serious. But I think as a strategy, so I'd say my suggestion is that documentary photography learns from TikTok and to embrace laughter as a way of telling stories. But I'm not speaking from massive experience.
Did you not produce TikTok videos while you were in lockdown?
Would I be able to? No.
I probably wouldn't. No, I'm not on TikTok. I feel like, might not, I don't know. Maybe I'll start it. Probably, I'm overwhelmed with Instagram already, so maybe not. But yeah, maybe sometime in the future. So I just want to come back to what you said about as we know, photography is mainly dominated by white male voices. And you mentioned already your book, Firecrackers, which you made together with Fiona Rogers. And we talked about whether I should show it, but, it might be a little bit awkward. But yeah, a very, very amazing photo book. So and I want to talk about how what further steps could be taken towards making documentary photography more inclusive and championing these voices more. You've mentioned it briefly, but are there strategies, or how could that be pursued?
Yeah, I mean, to talk a little bit about Firecracker, I mean, just to give total full credit to Fiona Rogers, the platform is absolutely hers, and she does it out of pure love. She very kindly invited me to co-author the book with her in 2017, and we'll be doing some more Firecracker work together. But the whole, the generation and all the work of Firecracker, the platform, is purely Fiona. And even that actually charts how documentary photography has changed. So it started off being a platform for female European photographers, and then because the book was launching worldwide, and because of the world being worldwide, but Firecracker became a worldwide platform, and now obviously it's female identifying and non-binary photographers. So that's just an example of being nimble. It's a word I've heard used a lot during these pandemic times, just that ability to be nimble, and Firecrackers being that. It didn't need to be this thing, then it stayed being this thing. And I've just seen really amazing work. I mean, I wrote some names down so that I could remember them all. I don't even know if I need it, but Peyton Fulford, Ronan McKenzie, Huda Afshar, R. Peter Singh, Amit Mahmoodian, Jessie Boone Cowler, Zaneli Maholi. And Zaneli was in the book. The rest of the people that I mentioned are newer people to the platform. They're not necessarily new artists, but for one reason or another, either just Fiona thinks they're fully brilliant. Well, she definitely thinks they're fully brilliant, but possibly also thinks that they've been overlooked, or some of them are, you know, quite new and emerging artists. And you know, just again to really credit Fiona, but she really looks around. She's not complacent. She's not comfortable with all of the people she already knows. And you know, that there's a really important call to everybody who does have some kind of position of power in the industry to, if you've got a commissioning role or a job giving role or whatever it is, but to commission people of colour, you know, not falling back on your contacts book. And again, you know, I'm sure that I'm preaching to the converted and people who already know this, but obviously there are huge numbers of people who don't, and it's like, how do you get that message out further? And I think that it's, if people of colour, for example, and all minority voices are making images that are seen, for example, in the mass media, in the broadcast press, that does have a really huge audience rather than a little photo book or something, then that automatically changes what is seen because of who's seeing. And it's just, it's kind of basic. You know, it's about educating our eyes, especially white people, and pulling them away from the stuff that you're comfortable with and already know, and just looking, just literally looking in different directions. And if you read theory to inform your practice, also read Black theorists. You know, I'm sure that people like Fanon and Mbembe being read, but what about Jasbir Kouar, for example, Teju Cole, Ta-Nehisi Coates? You know, are these people? Patricia J. Williams, who was speaking about microaggressions in 1997, and you know, I didn't know her work then, but I didn't know when I did know her work that she'd used that term and brought that, you know, into recognition. And I think, you know, mentor people if you can. If you're in a position where you could mentor someone, please do that. If you're in such a position where you could actually step back and let another voice in, do that. I think just really noticing people, all people, especially people of colour, but listening to people as well. And it's just thinking that if you imagine, I was thinking of what could you imagine without people of colour, without Black people. I was thinking of music. So it's so preposterous to imagine music without Black voices. Yeah. And so therefore it's completely preposterous to imagine every other like form of culture without Black voices too. So yeah, apply that to everything. I think. I mean, obviously, I don't have all the answers, and I want people to tell me what to do a lot. Please.
Someone sent something into the chat. At our last year, there were 50% of exhibiting artists were women. Should this be standard at a photo festival?
No, I believe it should be a lot more.
Yeah.
Seriously.
But that also brings me to the next question, because you know, the role that art institutions played in that exclusion is just, you know, when you start thinking about it, it's, and you know, really engage with it, it's just overwhelming into thinking that, you know, that these people, you know, also in a position to power could have, you know, made a difference in championing these other voices. Like, do you feel like that is opening up now, or is it, because I still think it's quite slow.
Slowly is right. And just to answer the person's question, sorry, I didn't see who asked it. They picked it up in a millisecond. But just to say that I think that if people are really, really looking at the work that's there and really making the conditions attractive to people in any kind of minority to come in and show work, then, you know, the photo festivals will automatically have tons of work by, or, you know, minorities, because they're making the most brilliant, the most interesting work. So that's what I meant by that answer. And hopefully it wouldn't have to be quotas per se, because it should be, it would just be brilliant. The work, if it comes in, if it gets seen in the first place, it is there. And so, sorry, to go on to your question about institutions, Vera, Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, about there've been some great stuff like Liberate Tate, obviously, and what Nan Goldin's doing with Purgy Farmer and Sackler, etc. And lots of other people are obviously involved in these protests as well. But the thing about the Whitney Biennial was kind of good and depressing in equal measure. So 8 artists withdrew from the biennial because of Warren, what's his name? I've got it written down, Warren Kanders, who was on the board there. And, eventually they were protesting against him because he's the CEO of Safariland. It's a weapons manufacturer. And, so great, he's left the Whitney, but it's the basic thing of small talk. Hello, what do you do? Oh, I run a weapons company. Oh, maybe you shouldn't be on our board. I mean, it's obviously to do with flows of capital and where capital comes from. And obviously the art world needs money, but yeah, it's like I said, depressing and at least good that he resigned in equal measure. I don't know. I mean, if you look at the whole principles of the way art is valued in the first place, the way museum collections are just soaked in colonial practices, the whole idea of looted art and stolen property. Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether to digress onto how I read this really interesting piece on Hyperallergic about the etymology of the word loot, and it was used in Hindi but as a colonial word that meant, it was kind of used pejoratively about the masses uprising. And so whereas it's right to use it in terms of museums looting because they've just gone in there brawling and stolen it because they had the power, but then really misused in terms of people who are active in current unrest for really important reasons. I mean, it's just all of these things that are wrapped up in each other. And the gatekeepers in the institutions, who are the figureheads? I mean, we literally cannot ring up in photography in London, we cannot ring up Mark Seeley every time we want a leading black person in the arts to say something in all seriousness. And the way our black colleagues and colleagues of colour, they're probably finding themselves asked to speak a lot in these, the death of George Floyd, and the people who aren't mentioned as much, like Breonna Taylor, who also was murdered by the police in March. I mean, she was shot 8 times in a drug raid and no drugs were found.
Yeah, the person was already in custody. The person that they were looking for was already in custody. It's like, oh, great.
And
that's the police.
Exactly. And in 2014, the Eric Garner, who also said, I can't breathe. No one who was killed by the police by NYPD as well, no one was prosecuted. And it's like, if the police is racist, society's racist, institutions are racist, and the people who run the institutions and are the institution, we are racist. I mean, I do think that some of the statements that institutions have released in the light of Black Lives Matter are real. I think I'm good, and too late, and all good. But some of them sound like they've been forced out of people, and it made me think about acting. That I think I put on Instagram that I wanted to talk about active images, and hopefully, in some way, everything that we're talking about is kind of to do with actors and activism. But obviously there are different versions of the idea of to act. And do institutions act? Do they want to take action, or are they just acting? Are they saying, yeah, we've got to say this thing? And it's not always obvious. It's not always clear that institutions are really doing things for the right reasons. But the ones that are, and a lot of them are, they need to be fully supported by government and by policy and by funding. And in the UK, and I'm sure in the US at the moment, that's not looking, it's not looking great. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to be horribly pessimistic, and I do want to acknowledge the good stuff. But yeah, I think like at the end of all my answers, I could just say, and it's a really shit time.
They will always work. But I'm just gonna, I think we're not gonna get through with all the questions. And I wanna, some people ask question in the chat. I just wanna quickly, last question by me, or maybe not the last question, but what you said about acting, I remember you said the last time we spoke, you said that the camera is an activist tool. You know, it could be an activist tool. So, and that really stuck with me because, you know, at the kind of the intentions of documentary photography, not all of them are good, but mostly people, you know, try to make aware of something and want to draw attention to something. And quite often it's very political matters. So how do you think that, how could photography in that perspective be used as a tool to, you know, unpick and overturn structural racism, or is it even possible?
I mean, I think one body of work that I haven't mentioned so far is Polemy Basu's amazing work from Nepal, Blood Speaks. She used VR as a technology for that, but you know, the young girls are ostracized when menstruating in really dangerous ways, and all sorts of abuses happen to them. And her work actually changed the law, helped to change the law in Nepal against that, so they can't be ostracized anymore. So I think it's very rare that photography per se can actually really activate social change. I mean, one of the things that, the reason that David Birkin and I started Visible Justice, I haven't really talked about, is interdisciplinarity, which I think is a massive turn, if you like, in our industry. That interdisciplinarity is the way that people are thinking. But you know, Visible Justice exists purely as a platform for artists, activists, journalists, human rights lawyers, photographers, etc., but working at the intersection of visual culture and social justice. And the point of our events, which have so far been mostly symposia, but also a pop-up film exhibition and a larger scale public program exhibition at LCC, and sort of starting to collaborate with other more public organisations. You know, it's to see what happens when people from these different spaces actually talk with each other, and how the image can lead to new forms of knowledge. Yeah, I mean, we're working on something in relation to climate emergency and colonialism, and one in relation to kind of COVID witnessing and algorithmic bias. But it's just the role of the image in these discussions is really vital. And then the other thing, I mean, obviously photography is being used in relation to protest, which I think is a really tricky one. And again, it was on Hyperallergic that I was listening to this really interesting discussion about, you know, what should photographers do? Should they be blurring faces to keep people safe, to keep protesters safe? Because actually from historic protests, people have been, with using photographs, people have been arrested and even disappeared because of that. I think it's a big ask for the photograph alone to do stuff. And I think it's when it comes together with all these other kinds of discourses. I mean, another talk, listened to two other talks in the last couple of days, and the Adam Brumberg talk was really unexpected. I don't know if people in the room saw it, but he was like sitting on a sofa in southern Germany with a Syrian human rights lawyer and an artist called Khaled Barake. And Khaled had made these sculptures of headless people that he'd stood as a protest outside a courtroom in, what's it called, Koblenz. Sorry, I had to write that city down because I haven't heard of it. Koblenz in southern Germany, which is where the first Syrian torture trial is taking place. Two people are being accused of torture during the Syrian war. And Adam Brumberg was there just to photograph the artworks. That was his role as an artist himself. He was just there to document this form of artistic practice. And I think that being, again, that word nimble, but of what needs to be done, how can the image be really active here, and what do I need to do? And that was a case of him, I think, stepping back and just literally being the person who documented it. That was really, really interesting. And the other talk I was going to mention, I just tuned into Lyra Brill's talk, and the depth of her research on, let's just say, the history of misogyny in total. It's just amazing. And so the talk becomes about that. Yes, there's a photo, but yes, there's an exhibition in Arles. But the talk becomes about the subject when the photography has done at least some of its job, which is to bring people together. It's such a human thing, photography, bringing people together and provoking discussion. And I suppose yeah, this, to go back to the beginning, this idea of documentary photography as the suspended image, if we want to do that, you know, maybe it could be liberatory in some way. I guess it depends who's talking, and I guess it depends who's listening.
Very true.
I'm looking.
So thank you so much for answering all my questions. Is it okay if we just answer some of the audience as well?
Yeah, can I see? I'm going to try and see.
If you click on the Q&A button, maybe you see them.
Oh yeah, I can.
Okay. So where are the first one? Ayanava asked how and what to be written in a study proposal in the application for MA in documentary and photojournalism. So what kind of tips would you get? Yeah, what would for the study proposal?
Oh, so what would you really interest you if you could get access to it, if you could research it well enough? What subject, and how do you think it could be? Why do you think that photography is a good method for it? You know, how would you make it visual? You're probably better to talk about this.
No, mine was 24 pages, I remember. And then Michaela told me, oh, mine was just bullet points. I was like, what?
So yeah, I think just being really honest. Honestly, don't we'll just hear your voice in there and hear about what interests you, hear about who you are. You know, you don't have to show some amazing kind of legacy of all this knowledge you have. You just have to come committed to the idea of using the image to tell stories and to find out stuff, basically.
I guess a good question would also be, is like, why would you be the person to do that project?
That's an important question. Exactly. Yeah. So if you're suggesting doing something, you know, a million miles away, so maybe that's perfect. Maybe you've got a really important connection to that, but tell me why that is. Thank you, Vera. That's very important. Exactly. So always trying to understand who you are in relation to making the work, examining, your relation to the subject matter. But it doesn't need to be a beautifully crafted essay. Bullet points, as per Michaela, are also fine. Was it just the study proposal? Oh, and also just to say that it's not a legal document, and you're not bound to it. If you decide to completely change your mind when you come on the course, then that's to be expected.
I did.
Exactly.
And then Marco is asking, I recently enjoyed a lecture by John Henry on his Stranger Fruit series. We could argue that he documents Black mothers and their sons across the US, but at the same time, they perform by assuming the Pieta pose. Any comments on contemporary documentary photographers altering or constructing the scenes they capture?
I don't know that body of work in question at all, so I can't comment on that. In terms of symbols of Christian and Western iconography, such as the Pieta, I think that there might be different ways to represent people now, and I'd be glad for that, rather than falling back on, you know, perhaps the history of art doesn't have to be the history of documentary photography. I feel that really strongly. It's like, why does photography have to take that lineage? It really doesn't. It can have all kinds of other lineages. And do I have any problem with constructed photography? Not in the slightest. No, I think really absolutely whatever you need to do, you just tell people what you're doing. So the only problem is if you've done something and you said you didn't, which, you know, there are a million instances of that, and I'm not you know, I'm not a Photoshop type person, but yeah, if you want to set up an image because that will make the story stronger, then yeah, please do. I mean, I think that's really different to kind of taking a picture of a protest or something and altering it. Although having said that, I've just suggested doing that by blurring the faces. So no, I don't have problems with anything being changed. It just has to be done honestly and ethically, and for whoever's receiving it for that to be understood. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And Adriana said, "Hi Max, we love you. Given the challenges and sensitivities to discussions about race and inequality, how can we best introduce this topic in ways that are dismantling the harms historically caused by photography? How are you doing this in a manner that is constructive, meaningful, and safe?" Homey House Press.
Homey House Press do it amazingly. If I could, have these guys come and run a workshop like every week on the course, I'd love to do that. I think thinking about whose bodies are shown in what kind of ways and the trauma that might bring, the title of the work that was mentioned earlier that I'm afraid I don't know, but to even use a title like Strange Fruit, which refers to lynchings, is deeply traumatic, especially if that would be your ancestry. And I think that when the black and brown bodies are seen so often as brutalized bodies, then is it causing further pain to just keep showing such imagery in the same way? So I think that's a really important thing to recognize. How else can I answer that? I can't see the question. Have I finished? Well, I definitely haven't finished answering it, but can you just repeat a bit of it again, please?
How can we best introduce this topic, so the topic of race and inequality, in ways that are dismantling the harms historically caused by photography, and how are you doing this in a manner that is constructive, meaningful, and safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the argument that Daniel Campbell Blight sets out in his book about whiteness, that started as a lecture at the RCA with George Yancey that I went to, called "What Can White People Do?" In how to kind of apprehend whiteness as well, as a thing, and not just always talk about black and blackness, but to really talk about whiteness. White privilege is a phrase that people are familiar with, but actual whiteness as the thing that has structured society needs to be tackled a lot more. I think that some of the things that can be done. I mean, and like I say, Adriana, I want you for sure to tell me, and I want lots of other voices to join in conversations like this. And how can you make work that, can you make work about communities that are not your own? Absolutely, you can, but recognize, obviously we're not going to silo. That's a horrible idea. I think siloing people into only making work about the communities that they're directly from, but how are you ethically and responsibly and kindly in a community, or even recognizing that you're outside a community in all of those ways, but still making work about it. I think just taking an ethical position, and you can't not do that in documentary photography, because it has this association with the real, and the real is real life, and it's our life, and it matters.
Yeah, intentions, like just clearly define what are your intentions and why. Yeah. So one last question from Marussia.
One thing. It's just about it kind of goes back to the Whitney thing, though. It's like, who are your people, and who's sponsoring you? And this came up at the university at LCC this week, and it's like, you look at a magazine and you look at who its founders are, and you find a white supremacist in there, and it's like, but hang on, the university's partnering with this institution, and did anyone think about this? And I think that really it's just always about paying attention, and it's really bloody hard work, and so it really should be.
Yeah, really. It should. Yeah, I think it should just become, the usual thing to do is that you just thoroughly research a person before you, start to engage with them or hire them for anything. A background. So Marussia is asking, how do you get away from the self-fulfilling prophecy of picking African photographers to show their work or vision of the continent, but yet still portray or do images for Western audiences? I guess is how can Black African voices be heard outside of the obvious visual media outlets?
So outside of representing what stereotypes about African countries or different spaces. I wish I could read questions better. Hello, Mauricia, by the way. Mauricia is another maker, and you should hire Mauricia.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you say something again?
How do you get away from the self-fulfilling prophecy? Maybe I'm saying that word wrong. Prophecy of picking African photographers to show their work or vision of the continent, but yet still portray or do images for Western audiences. So basically, you know, how it's appropriated for a different audience.
Absolutely. So I think it's like the really real thing where it's like, oh yes, so that person, that African person makes work that a white person can understand because possibly they've been taught, in that way. I'm sometimes really conscious of that with international students. It's like wanting to know. I mean, I'm thinking more a few years ago, but wanting to know, the history of Western photography, and it's like, really, can I know about yours? And I got 1 year I had 9 Chinese students in the cohort, and I worked with them for a term, and it culminated in those guys doing a presentation on Chinese photography, which taught me loads. And I think, so what are the image making practices in the region that whoever wants the work from? And I think someone like Ada Malune in Addis, her images are just off the scale, exciting. And I think someone like, Rona Mackenzie's in South London, but oh my goodness, the images she made of her mother, she wasn't following, some kind of prescribed, oh, this is what you do in documentary photography. It's so personal and gorgeous. And I think just, this is going to take a lot of work. It's like, how can you find out about existing image cultures in different countries? Because there's huge ignorance about that. And I think that when that can be found, the kind of work in other media and getting shown in the most important big places, I think it will change because the work is going to be brilliant. I think it's about tuning the Western eye into something else and recognizing that as good and brilliant as opposed to different and strange. That's again, it's work and good.
Good work.
I hope that answers it a bit, Mauricia. It's a good question.
I think we just have to, it will, it starts with being more inclusive, getting to see, make it, it's just should be normal that we see this diversity, and it shouldn't just be, only really just picked when a Black Lives Matter movement is starting. But we already overran, but I could do this for a lot longer. Maybe I just have to get you in for part 2.
Oh yeah, I'm sure everyone would be fascinated. But it's absolutely lovely speaking with you, and it's just that I know that the people in the audience, I know that they can't access it, but I would so love to hear Mauricia, Adriana, and the people. And here comes Coco. Hello, Coco. Speaking about that's the problem when there's only 2 of us. It's like, oh, in relation to so she thinks that, right? So what? And absolutely, so fucking what? Definitely, so fucking what? But it's and it's as often as possible about sharing space and listening to voices and amplifying other voices, and definitely other voices than mine. And yeah, I certainly hope that in my work with Firecracker curatorially, and with writing, although that's normally commissioned, but anyway, I hope that to some extent I do that.
Yeah, I know you do.
It's been really lovely to speak with you, Vera. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks so much for accepting the invitation. And yeah, the time went by so fast, and I'm definitely up for part 2 if you are, or we can, like you said, have more of a panel discussion or something like that.
Well, that would be nice. That would be really nice. Why don't we do that with the people who ask the questions? And this is what we do with Visible Justice. Literally at the end of every Visible Justice, it's like we're told what to do next. So let's do that with the people who have been asking questions here.
Sounds like a plan. All right. I'll talk to you soon, Max. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you
Bye.
soon. Bye.